Well, I'm joined now from Jerusalem by an advisor to Benjamin Netanyahu, the former Israeli ambassador to the UN, Dore Gold. Good evening. First of all, can we deal with Beit Hanun? Now, the Israeli Defense Force insists there was nobody in that compound. But you heard there Bob Turner, who's head of UN mission in Gaza, insisting there were people there, there were children there. Is the UN not telling the truth?
Well, I don't think we can resolve this on a BBC television show. It has to be looked at and examined very carefully. Israel has its own self-investigative methods, which have been respected by the world community in the past. And I'm sure, as we have looked at other incidents in the Gaza Strip, we will very carefully examine what happened in Beit Hanun. It's our initial estimate that in Beit Hanun, Israel didn't cause the damage that you're describing.
But let's be quite clear here. You are saying that the UN version of events could be wrong. Really? The UN?
Well, we're talking about an incident that just occurred in a very intense combat zone. But I'll tell you this a little bit about how Israel...
It was in an area where there were children playing.
That's right. And Israel makes every effort possible to avert civilian casualties. I mean, I don't know another army in the world that set up a whole Arabic-speaking unit to drop leaflets in areas with maps to people to say, look, this area is going to become a combat zone, missiles are stored here, training is going on here, command and control centers are located in this area. Please leave because we're going to have to operate here.
But right now, because Gaza is so intensely packed, Dore Gold, because there is such intense packing of people into Gaza, what's happened is there are over 1,000 people dead, 75% of them civilians, and at the moment, toll is rising. 226 children. Tonight, Benjamin Netanyahu said you need stamina and determination. Does that mean there is no end to the death toll? There is no upper limit? If 1,000 children die, it can't be helped?
Well, let me remind you of one fact. This war was initiated by Hamas, which launched rockets at our cities. The reasons why you don't have thousands of Israelis dead is because Israel invested in civil defense shelters and in an anti-missile system. Hamas did not build that for the Palestinian people. What it built were attack tunnels, tunnels which would allow its operatives, heavily armed, to go into Israeli villages like Kibbutz Nachal Oz, like what happened today, and massacre its population. Now, we are doing everything possible to minimize civilian losses, and if you let me explain it, I'll show you how. But we cannot apologize for the fact that the government of Israel is protecting its people, whereas Hamas is sacrificing its people as human shields.
But let's just be quite clear. There is no upper limit to the dead in Gaza. There is no decision that perhaps if 1,000 children die, it's too many. It will just be the casualties of war.
You waged a war as a NATO member against Yugoslavia and Kosovo. Some 2,000 civilians died so that Kosovo could be free and independent from Yugoslavia. And do you know why you did that? You did that because you estimated that Milosevic and his forces would massacre the Albanian population in Kosovo. So, wars do have their costs, but we make every effort to follow the laws of war and to minimize the damage. For example, what country has Arabic-speaking soldiers who call the cell phones of people living in an area and tell them a strike is about to occur because this is a legitimate military target? What other country sends, excuse me.
You repeated that from earlier, and I want to press you on that, because if you do make those calls, and I have no reason to doubt you do make those calls, you're talking about women and children and civilians trying to get out the way, but where to? Where can they get out the way of your shells?
That's an excellent question. And so one of the things you have to do is when you design a leaflet or any kind of communication with the population, you have to have a map with a route for where they should go. And that's exactly what the Israeli army does. Now, you also have Hamas telling the population, don't leave. They tell them. We also have evidence that they pay them so they don't leave. And unfortunately, you get these situations arising. Now, Hamas also doesn't know how to handle...
Let's turn to Israeli casualties.
Pardon?
Let's turn to Israeli casualties now. Because from 2001 to the 28th of July, there were 35 casualties. But in the last 3 weeks, there have been 51 casualties. 13 years, 35 casualties. 3 weeks, 51 casualties. How does that make any sense to Israel?
You're talking about the fact that we've had so few casualties?
No, I'm talking about the fact that you've had more casualties in the last 3 weeks than you've had in 13 years.
Well, one of the reasons is when you send in combat troops in door-to-door fighting, which is done to minimize casualties on the other side, among other reasons, you're going to face a very difficult time, and you will lose soldiers. And this also happened to us in Jenin back in 2002. It's the same experience. You know, you can always, in these kinds of wars, try and use overwhelming air power, you know, like the Allies did in World War II, or like the Russians did in the First Chechen War. We don't follow that policy. We're not going to napalm whole areas. We're going to ask the people to leave. We'll supply them with maps of how to get out of the way. We'll communicate them with text messages in Arabic. And we are doing our best to protect our population as well as the Palestinian population. But we're at war not with a democracy. We're at war with a terrorist organization designated as such by the European Union.
Let's come back to today. 8 children and 2 adults at the latest count killed at a beach club in Gaza. If it turns out they were killed by the Israeli military, you have failed yet again to spare civilians.
You're involved in a high-tempo combat zone. We will investigate all these situations. We have a judge advocate general in the Israeli army. Many other armies, investigations are handled by the division commander. That's not true in the Israeli army. So that the division commander will often protect his soldiers. The judge advocate general wants to get to the bottom of this. And if he doesn't do his job,
it's all very well to investigate after the fact. But repeatedly, you have inadvertently or whatever killed civilians, including 228 children. You must regret that.
Of course, we have deep regret, and Israelis feel terrible sadness when they hear the news of any loss of a civilian on the Palestinian side. But you know something? We also feel rage, and the rage is directed against Hamas, who puts civilians in that position. It is Hamas that wants to sacrifice its people for political purposes.
But you do accept that perhaps you do accept that perhaps it was Israeli firepower, Israeli missiles that killed those children today. That is possible. By the very fact you're having an investigation, you must admit that it's possible.
You always have to check yourself, and I hope the British Army and the American Army and the German Army do the same thing. You've had these issues in Afghanistan and in Iraq, which you have also investigated.
Dore Gold, thank you very much for joining us.